Great. Well, good afternoon, online folks and in the room folks. We're really happy to be here for this facilitated Think Aloud, which I know generally these are presentations of research data. I was here for such a short amount of time that many things are very much in process. But we also feel like one of the outcomes for my semester here was to think about international partnerships and what they currently look like, what they could look like, and what they might mean in our specific context. And part of that is, we hope, something that will emerge from the ground up versus from the top down, which is why a conversation or a facilitated Think Aloud seemed like a great way to start. So I'm Sarah Jewett. I'm from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, or UMBC in Baltimore, Maryland. I am so fortunate to have been hosted by the Storytelling Academy and Mike at Loughborough University this semester. The time has absolutely flown, and part of the reason it's flown is because Storytelling Academy has been such a welcoming place and really invited me to really participate in so many different ways, from teaching to research to community engagement. And that has enabled me to really think about what those pieces mean as they sit at the heart of a larger institutional and more formal institutional partnership. So in many ways, being busy and active and engaged has given me the lens to be in this conversational space. So I'm very happy about that. I'm an educational anthropologist, so I focus on spaces of teaching and learning, and storytelling is one of those spaces that I look at. I'm going to turn it over to my partner, my Think Aloud partner here.
Yeah, so I mean, Sarah is the first Fulbright scholar that we've had in the Storytelling Academy, and I was very excited when Sarah said she wanted to first apply, and then when we got the news that she was able to come, because I guess one of the benefits for us is not only having Sarah here, but just that having someone from outside coming and embedding themselves in your team for, you know, a 3-month period enables you to think out, get outside of the institutional think that we all find ourselves drawn into. And on one level, this today feels like an extension of conversations we've had, not only this term, but actually over a number of years. So this is well, not even the culmination. It's the end of one phase, the beginning of a next phase of collaboration that started a number of years ago, and has very slowly, gradually been building up. And we've been taking opportunities to strengthen those links in quite modest, small ways, but that has provided the foundation, I think, for this Fulbright scholarship. But so in one sense, it feels like a continuation of discussions, but on the other hand, it also feels like an opportunity to shift gear a little bit, and not just in terms of speed, but in terms of the way that we imagine international partnerships might work and what the benefits might be. Because I know we were talking about this yesterday, Sarah. So you know, in a way I'm repeating myself, but no one else has heard this. We were talking about how very often in institutions, when we think about international partnerships, we're thinking sort of quite high. We're thinking about our role as strategic global citizens and all those kinds of things. And all of our language around international is kind of inflected with notions of quality. So even in the ref, for instance, the way that the word international is used in the ref is as a marker of quality. And I'm not saying that's not the case. I'm not saying we shouldn't always aim for international reach and connections. But there's also this idea that, you know, it's all, and you think, well, what if we had international partnerships that were also here as well? And we're involved in a lot of community level work as well. A lot of our, yes, we have, you know, international global NGO partners, you know, but we also have quite local partnerships with small NGOs, community organizations, informal groups at community level. So we're thinking, okay, how do they fit into that picture of internationalization? You know, I mean, if I'm working with, or say in the past we've worked, say, with small groups in the informal settlements in Nairobi, for instance, it's international from our perspective. And it's probably international from their perspective in the sense that they've got UK researchers going with them. But a lot of the people we're working with will not have left their village, will not have left their town, will certainly not have left Nairobi in their lives. So how do you make that part of a bigger global perspective and an international perspective? And it's not necessarily about, you know, hobnobbing and networking with the ambassador and you know, and so forth, and the director or CEO of this organisation or that organisation. It's actually about how these things link up. And we said we were not going to mention the word global because we thought that was a very much a 90s word. So but I've just mentioned it now just to get it out of the way. So don't make that mistake again.
Yes,
but it is really about how we rethink these relationships in, I suppose, more meaningful ways for the kind of work that we do. And it's not about not having those high level connections and networks, and they're very important because they enable us to do things. But it's also about how do we make sense of the more local work that we do within that global context, and how can these partnerships benefit that and make that work more effective?
And, you know, one of the upsides and maybe downsides, right, of having anthropologists and storytellers work together is they're always asking this question: how do we make sense of? How do we make sense of? Right, which is great because it gives you that space to step back, right, and to sort of think about how are you making sense of it, and how is it different from the way other people are making sense of it, and where do we bring those constructions of meaning together. So we wanted to start by getting a sense of the folks in the room. So we're actually going to pull you in right from the get-go into the conversation. So what happens when I think we are. Yeah. So quick introductions. We'd really, just to run you through what we're going to do for the next not much time together, is sort of who's in the room, a short history. Mike sort of referenced that this is not the starting point nor the ending point, but this lovely point in the middle where we're trying to figure out what's next. And then thinking about mapping the future. So very much, you know, with when we think about co-production or community engagement in the center, what then does international partnerships look like? And then sort of an invitation to continue to help us think about what this looks like. So if we can just go around quickly, we don't have that many, so it's a nice way to bring people in. Just your name, department. I think maybe your all home institution is here, but that hasn't always been true at other talks. A quick example of an interface you've had with an international partnership. It doesn't have to be a whole story, just sort of a quick, I was able to do this. And then an assumption or an aspiration around international partnerships. So I know you probably weren't expecting to have to say something right away, but I will say as a quick interface, so I'm going to name a typical one to get the typical one out of the way. So I've been involved with leading study abroad, right? So that with an institution that was situated in Ireland. So I collaborated with an institution, took a group of students. We were able to really take advantage of the networks, the research, the local expertise of another university. Now I name that because that's a very sort of traditional, typical sort of experience we think about with university inter-institutional partnerships. And I wanted to get that in the mix. Of course, we're hoping to diversify that perception as well. And my aspiration is to begin to think about what community engagement at the center of partnership begins to look like. So I'll pass it over to you, Mike.
Okay, so I was just thinking, I mean, we've certainly done lots of international research projects, but I actually just wanted to mention our master's program that Fred is the director for, that we have a master's program that recruits a modest number of students, but an incredibly diverse group of students from a range, I mean, diverse in every sense, but also from a range of nationalities, and often nationalities that aren't necessarily represented in great numbers on the campus. And I think that diversity has been really, really useful and has reflected the diversity of colleagues that we've had working in the Storytelling Academy, and so has promoted, I think, for us a sense of being part of a sort of more of a global picture, and that's been very helpful and very useful for us, and it's part of what I bang on about the ecosystem of the work that we do that entangles the teaching and the research and everything else that we do together. In terms of aspirations, I'm aware that very often when we think about these partnerships, we'll say, oh, can we think of a research project we could do together? And we'll find a call that's, you know, a couple of million quid, and we'll say, let's go for that one. And we put all our eggs in that particular basket, and we know that the chances of success there are small, and the likelihood is, you know, momentum will slowly start to run out after a series of unsuccessful applications. So I'm becoming increasingly interested in the idea of a series of small cooperations, and the importance of small cooperations. And that, I think, also characterises some of the partnership that we've developed over the past whatever 6-7 years, or whatever, you know, and it's led to this point, but it's actually been a series of quite small cooperations. So we haven't always had to say, well, you know, if it's not big, it's not massive, it's not worth trying going for. Absolutely. So that's, I suppose, my aspiration is for more small cooperations and understanding the importance of those in building towards the bigger ones.
Linking them, connecting those.
Yeah.
Can I invite others?
Yeah, I'm Carolyn Scott-Jeffs, and I'm with the Storytelling Academy in the School of Design and Creative Arts. Quick example. I worked with Professor Jennifer Purcell at St Michael's University in Vermont, and we worked together studying very successful but much forgotten writer of radio comedy called Mabel Constanduros, which is a sort of ongoing thing for Jen and I. It's resulted in her writing a book, and I'm still working on the play and finding a home for that to go to. And that has been a very fruitful and enjoyable thing to work on, but probably quite traditional, I think, that sense of us having a link and kind of working together to share knowledge. And I think that until I encountered the Storytelling Academy, I sort of thought that's what international exchanges were kind of about, that you had a topic that you were interested in and that you kind of shared knowledge on that. And so I'm very interested in opening that up and looking at other possibilities.
I love that. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Prof. Cullen. So I'm a historian based in the School of Social Sciences and Humanities. And I work on mostly on Kenya and the history of the end of empire in Kenya. So I guess what drew me to this, what really interests me, is thinking about international partnerships in the. So I have plenty of experience in these, like we're talking about these, you know, working with colleagues in America or Canada or whatever it might be, but thinking about these where actually there is more of an inequality in these partnerships. And so I guess my aspiration would be to think about how do we make these more equitable? How are these not just a kind of north-south partnerships? And so, you know, I'm not sure I've done that very well, but
it's not easy, is it? I mean, we were talking about this again yesterday. The work that we did in Kenya and Uganda was funded through what was called the Global Challenges Research Fund back in the day, but it ended around COVID time. But it was really about giving UK researchers the opportunities to work in low to middle income countries, but it was specifically around creating equitable partnerships. That was the term that was used time and time again. And I sat on a few panels as well in the peer review college around this. and it was an easy phrase to throw around
Mhm.
a little bit,
Yeah.
to be honest. A lot of those applications were for working in Kenya. Kenya was very overrepresented from that. Why was Kenya overrepresented? Because it's relatively easy for UK researchers to work there. English is widely spoken. You know, the institutions of government and of education are modelled on British and legality. They're modelled on British models. You know, they drive on well, actually, they drive wherever they want to, mostly in Nairobi, but theoretically, they should be driving on the left. All of these cultural signifiers are not difficult for UK researchers to get used to when they're working in Nairobi. But there was one thing I remember going into a workshop once, and it was in Mukuru, one of the big slum areas, and we had a group of local people who were coming in to spend a day in the workshop, and as is expected and fine, they were receiving a small sum of money to be present in that workshop. Because it was their time, and that was perfectly fine. And that level of pay that they were getting was determined by the Slum Dwellers Union. So it wasn't us saying you get this amount, and it was pitched at an amount that was supposed to be in comparison with other things they might be doing, was fair. So there was no kind of problems with the members of the community that weren't involved in the workshop. However, when we were sat there, I realised that by the time I'd sat in that workshop for 10 minutes, I'd earned what they were going to be earning in their whole day. Now, that was part of an equitable partnership, but it was really difficult. And that is part of that caused me a great discomfort on one level, but it was done for the right reason, you know, and I couldn't have changed it. And I'm not sure it would have been right to change it at that point, but structurally, there are all kinds of inequalities that you're having to work with, and there's an equitable partnership. Doesn't even scratch the surface of, you know. But it's really difficult. You know, we bandy these words. Yeah, let's have an equitable partnership, but it's a very difficult work, and you have to be really vigilant around it, I think.
And I think the other piece of that, and you know, it's something we can come back to at the end, is because we tend to have these more dichotomous, you know, north-south, rather than having multiple sort of stakeholders that can each hold each other accountable. And so, though I appreciate how many of those partnerships there are, I think as we think about equitable partnerships, that also means having multiple partners so that there's a solidarity behind some of the multiple claims as well, so that it doesn't offset, it helps to offset the power imbalance. It doesn't all correct it all, as you well know. But yeah, I think we do tend to dichotomize a lot of those, and we run into some trouble with the equitable piece of that for sure. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, hello, my name is Fred Dalmasso, so I work here. I'm a member of the Storytelling Academy, and I'm the, yeah, that's it. And so an example of an interface, I worked recently on an EU-funded project as part of the Storytelling Academy project in Europe that we could do before Brexit. Let's not talk about that. And this is an example of many, but this one stuck with me because it was on the notion of crisis and tried to help young adults deal with all sorts of crises in their life through storytelling. And we worked with a range of partners from all over Europe, and beyond. From, for example, people from Ministry of Education in Turkey, but also small NGO from Sicily, one called People Help the People, working with migrants. And so internationalization in that respect, for me, is yeah, it can happen very locally, as you said, and on a big scale. And in my own work and what my aspiration of a project I'm working on now, it's bringing it home, all this knowledge and experience from this, and working with my friend Amit here on a project based on migration and mental health and storytelling, and trying to find a way to yeah, bring awareness to these three aspects. So migration, but not necessarily migration on big scale. Here we're talking about autobiographical performance that we're working on. So as a first generation migrant in France, but also first generation migrant in the UK, second generation migrant, and try to bring people in to tell the stories about what it means. So it's an internationalization on a small scale because it's based in Nottingham where we live and around this area, and bringing people with international backgrounds. Let's bring it like this. Yeah. That's it.
I guess it would make
Thanks, Fred.
sense for me to go. So my name is Anit Malhotra. I'm a therapist, but I've got a background in the arts, and I'm very keen on the space where the two meet, where mental health meets arts. I work with people I've come, from war-torn parts of the world, and the stories and the memories that they have need to be. They need some help in making sense of those experiences, sometimes very traumatic. But also work with the sense that we've got a similar place that we're all coming from. So just to have the conversation of, how can we get better at that, and sharing those stories and making those connections so that people can really live in somebody else's shoes, but also that's a therapeutic process is really, really important. I worked with Fred in the past with a project called Re-envisioning citizenship. We produced some work for that. What if we had that experience that we were all made of the same thing? What if that thing was music? That was the question. What if we were all made of music? So in terms of answering the three questions, I'm not sure how well I can, but my assumption would be that it's the potential of the question is immense, because it can bring people closer together. And I think as long as you keep that focus of how people's day-to-day lives can be affected by the work that you do, and anything you can do to reduce those barriers will have a very important aspect. I'm a bit of an outsider, but hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think thinking about those everyday experiences is what is really important. When I heard you saying that, and I kept saying, what if we were made of music? And that was sort of an international sort of question. What a great conversation that would be. But also that long-term sort of thinking about everyday practices and how we negotiate collective trauma, individual trauma, and some of that storytelling too across borders and boundaries. Yeah, thank you. I don't want to put you on the spot because you're.
I also feel like an outsider, but in a different way. You'll see. So my name's Emily Bradshaw. I work in the Research and Innovation Office here at Loughborough. So I was not at all prepared to this question, but I will add a little bit in. So I have a previous career as a research scientist and worked on lots of international collaborations with archaeologists actually in Scandinavia. So representing Denmark where I lived, but as an English person. But I suppose something I'll add in about the assumptions is something I hadn't thought about before being in the role that I'm in now in the sort of support, the professional services within the university. I hadn't thought about the international collaboration between research managers and administrators, the European research managers, and the sort of value in that level of collaboration internationally. So that's an assumption I think
it's a really important point though, Emily, because often where difficulties arise are often between sort of governance functions within the universities, because we're working to different systems. So
I found this on the web for work.
Thank you very much. I didn't ask you. I didn't ask for your intervention, Siri. Sorry. I mean, and I think it's really important that when we're developing these cooperations that we actually include professional services in those as well, because ultimately, we develop these things and then we dump all this stuff on your desk and say, could you sort this out for us?
And if we've got some sort of understanding of the sort of international
Yes.
aspect of that,
Yeah.
it's hugely helpful.
Yeah, we had a very complicated set of conversations around contracting on a Swedish project that we're involved with at the moment, and that was very, very long and drawn out, for all kinds of reasons, but largely because of differences in governance expectations around the contracting of partnerships.
And I think it raises that question of what can we be explicit about? Both that sort of we're figuring out equity, right? That we're not there and we're not pretending to be there, right? But also you can build trust and then have logistics sink the trust very quickly because people don't get paid or because, something happens and people feel betrayed in some way. So there's all those sort of elements that circle around in this as well.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, GCRF had great problems because of about contracting and payment to third parties in low to middle income countries and the need for due diligence and in what were often really kind of ad hoc NGO organisations who didn't have governance structures and legal sort of status in the way that they would do if they'd been set up in the UK.
Right.
And there was all kinds, people were tearing their hair out trying to get money out to Kenya or Uganda or wherever.
And we have the same problem even if we're working with community partners in our urban areas near us. It's very difficult to get payments out of the system. And so part of this asks us to sort of interrogate our own, even as we're doing work with other international partners, part of it is about interrogating our own institutional practices as well and saying, okay, so this is set up for a different kind of purpose. How do we think about what that looks like? Even if that's not our favorite thing to do, it's all part and parcel, I think, of this work.
Yeah.
Anybody else wanna? Anybody else? Anybody online? Okay. All right. All right, thank you so much. That was really helpful in getting our conversations started. We just wanted to give you a short snapshot of sort of where these conversations have emerged from, because one of the nice things about this partnership, as Mike said, is it sort of grew in these small sorts of ways. So I don't know that facilitating this conference is called small at the time. But why don't you talk about the first one, because I wasn't here for that.
So actually the first two are actually flipped around. So it kind of started in 2018 when our colleague Antonia Liguori, formerly of this parish, got an AHRC International Placement Award to go and spend, I think, 3 months at the Smithsonian in DC. And while she was there, she made contact with some of the educational partners that Smithsonian were working with at the time, including UMBC, was one of them, and started to collaborate, run some digital storytelling workshops, but also to enter conversations with colleagues who are already interested in that space and working in that space. And that was kind of the beginning. That was the kind of early work. And later that same year, it was the biannual International Digital Storytelling Festival. And that particular year in 2018, it was the turn for Europe to host it. And it was in Zakynthos in Greece. And I think we used the opportunity for some of the European money that we'd got from our European projects to support a small team from the Storytelling Academy to go over and participate in that conference. And that enabled us to have other discussions, because UMBC, certainly Bill Shrewbridge was there. I'm not sure if anyone else was there at the time, but certainly UMBC was represented at that conference. And at the end of it, I don't know how it happened, but somehow Loughborough volunteered to host the next conference, and UMBC volunteered to host the one after that. But we decided that actually they would be that they would be jointly convened by both institutions. So we would do 2 conferences together, but we would lead and host the first one, and UMBC would lead and host the second one. And we thought that was quite a good model and would give us a chance to collaborate a bit more. So that was scheduled for April 2020.
And we all know what
Which
happened
you
then.
can remember. So as a result, we had to postpone that with about a month to go. And instead we hosted something called the Digital Decameron. So if those who know Boccaccio's Decamerone, it's about this, so say it's a novel because it's written before novels existed, but it's a book that was written. It's about a group of Italian nobles who escape the plague and go and live in a country villa for a short period of time till the plague's gone. And during the time, in order to keep themselves entertained, they tell stories to each other. And it's 10 stories for 10 days, hence the Decameron. So we decided to gather the stories that people were hoping to have presented at the conference into our own digital Decameron and shared them online. And UMBC hosted that particular event. And we postponed the conference until the following year. And then we're into second lockdown, so we had to say, we're not going to do that either. So we then had an online conference because people were starting doing that by then, and we did a 24-hour Chase the Sun conference on midsummer it was, and we went started where it was sort of Australia and worked our way around with the sun for a 24-hour conference, and people joined in their particular time zone, and that was great. I was exhausting, but it was a great fun, and it was just me and Tony Sumner, I think one of our colleagues who were the only survivors of the old 24. Two of the oldest people in the committee kept going for that period. So that was great. And then the following year in 2022, we actually got around to hosting the conference here in Loughborough, and we were out of lockdown and everything. It turned out that event was a super spreader event, and we managed to host the conference, and then immediately all went down with COVID. But we got
Taking
through
it
the
around
conference.
to various
Yes,
localized.
yeah, but it was again a
settings.
really great opportunity for us to come together in person and sort of cement those relationships, those partnerships.
And teams, so
and
teams
teams.
of like a team came
Yeah.
from UMBC and a team came from one of our partners, Montgomery College, which Antonia also worked
Yeah.
with, and from the Smithsonian as well. So it felt like that had expanded greatly, partly because we were coming out of lockdown. And it
Sure.
was like, yes, let's go. But it was also a nice expansion of all the people who sort of been coming into digital storytelling. So it was sort of a culminating moment, I
Yeah.
think.
And that conference and the one the following year that we had in DC and Baltimore, they were put on by a international committee. So we were meeting anyway once a month to talk about and plan the conference. So the conversations were always happening. So we sent a team out to DC last year to that conference, including a number of our PhD students were able to go and present. And we took that opportunity to sign one of those MOUs, of which every university has drawfuls of them somewhere. But we were determined to make sure that this wasn't one of those that got forgotten about. Oh, be quiet, Siri. I don't know why it keeps doing that.
But those international conferences remind me of the point that you made. I mean, one of the next digital storytelling conference is going to be in Brazil in the fall. And everyone's very excited about it not being in North America or Europe, but being in Brazil. But there's a lot of interesting conversations that's come out of that. But because there's representation on that committee from multiple multiple countries, conversations become a little bit easier because other people can say, yeah, that's our experience too. Or, and it becomes easier to tell sort of counter stories when there's more people telling counter stories. So I think that's a really, a nice example that circles back to your point as well. Yeah, and then out of one of those and this is why face-to-face opportunities are nice, because people don't hang around in digital spaces, right? Unless you're in Gathertown or one of those other places where you hang out. And that's what makes some of these conversations happen. So Mike and I and a few other people started talking about what could we do after this? Because you do need, even if it's a little thing, keep the momentum going, right? And I think that's what Mike was saying. It doesn't have to be this grand scale. But it has to be something to keep the momentum going, because our schedules are so crazy, right? That it just collapses on itself if something doesn't keep it moving forward. So we talked about doing an exchange, and you sort of throw your hat in the ring and you think, well, like a grant proposal, we'll see what happens. And we were lucky. It happened. But this gave us an opportunity for a lot of face-to-face interaction, for a different way of understanding sort of what happens at the Storytelling Academy. And my outcomes from the semester were both to think about my own sort of research question, which is about the role of digital storytelling in fostering dialogue around climate change, but also to think about what are some of those practices from the Storytelling Academy that we can model our work after. We just launched the Public Stories Lab at UMBC, and though we've had a wonderful group of colleagues who've been doing storytelling across the campus for a long time and have been instrumental in bringing in new people like Bill Shoebridge, who you mentioned, those folks who have been welcoming of those of us who have come after that. And the opportunity to really think about how do we use the Public Stories Lab in the way that the Storytelling Academy has embraced a wide range of storytelling practices and methods and people. We've focused a lot on digital storytelling, but we were really impressed with the way that Storytelling Academy really has this applied storytelling focus. And we thought, how can we learn from those practices, both the way Storytelling Academy is structured, but also the values, the orientations, the ways that students are engaged, and how can we begin to think about those as model worthy practices that then we can take home and say, okay, what works here? And then that will create, we hope, more opportunities for students. During the semester here, we've been able to have virtual events at UMBC, and graduate students from the Storytelling Academy be able to participate and be key presenters. We've been able to have faculty members from UMBC come and be guest speakers in courses at the Storytelling Academy. So when you have these in-person interactions, they really facilitate a much broader and wider kinds of collaborations, even small ones, as we say.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a short history, not a graphic history, but a short history. And as we were thinking about today, and we're just going to scoop through this so we can get to some more conversation, but I was really interested as I looked at some of the research that was coming out about international partnerships. And I think this first one is really important for the conversations that we're having today. There's really been this shift, and this is into thinking about internationalization, which all of our institutions talk about, right? How do we internationalize the curriculum? How do we internationalize our programs? How do we create more study abroad? But there's this shift from this sort of small elite mobile group of students, right? The jet setters, to really thinking about how do we all benefit from this internationalization. And that means really thinking about what are all the broad ways we embed this practice across the university. And so part of that, and I like that they're really addressing this idea of carbon neutral. So what does that mean for the way in which we collaborate? Does that mean we don't go anywhere? No, of course not. But it means that it's part of our decision-making process. And I think that's a relatively new shift, based on obviously a lot of the traumatic things that are happening to the globe. But also thinking about, here we have linking the global to the local, right? So we often think about, and Mike and I talked about this yesterday, we start out thinking about the local, and then people progress over here, but we're trying to figure out how to loop the two back together again, right? But we often do think about them more of a linear trajectory rather than sort of the intersecting ecosystem, entangled. I like the word entangled, an entangled ecosystem. And then the other project, and again, I'm not going to read the quote to you, but you can see the citation if you're interested. I was really interested in the idea of co-creation and co-production at the center of these international institutional collaborations. And really thinking about, well, what does that mean? Like if we put our community engaged priorities, UMBC is a very really centers and foregrounds community engagement. Loughborough Storytelling Academy does as well. So what happens when we center that work of co-production, that community work, and start there and work our way out? How does that look different from when you start at the agreement level and work your way down? This goes to your point, I think, too. I liked this last line of co-production is about operating within conditions of uncertainty, messiness, and fluidity. Fixed partnerships are always going to create points of tension with this practice. And our job is to sort of figure out what that tension provides. What are the possibilities and challenges that come out of that? But I thought these two pieces were really nice ways of sort of thinking about the conversation and grounding in the literature of what we talked about yesterday. And really thinking about those actors. We often think about, looking at our local service base or our local delivery base, but what happens if we expand that conversation? This is sort of just what we were talking about, and that's where we want to open it back up. What are the values orientations? What happens if we start with that co-production and sustainability? How do we think about whose knowledge, what are the local inputs? And toward what end, which I think is the really important question to ask, right? If we think about just inclusive communities or transdisciplinary inquiries, right? How does that shape the way in which we facilitate these practices? I put an example of branching out because I thought that was a good example of all of these things with the way that it potentially could expand to other partners.
Sure.
And not just in North America or in Europe or Scandinavia, but potentially much farther beyond that. So do you want to give a quick?
Yeah, so just to very quickly, branching out is a UKRI funded project. It's led by NERC, Natural Environment Research Council, but is also partnering with the AHRC as well. And it is part of a large programme called the Future of UK Treescapes. So this is around future of UK treescapes, I guess. That's pretty self-explanatory. And UKRI funded a whole programme of different projects, from very large scale projects to smaller scale projects of knowledge exchange to fellowships over a 4 or 5 year period. And it's kind of coming to an end now. And branching out is a project that was funded under the first phase of major projects. So it's about a £2.4 million project with multiple partners. And its focus is looking at urban treescapes, but specifically at the social and cultural values of those treescapes. So the premise is, and I didn't know this until I started talking to the tree people. These are the academic, not sort of tree people, we're not entering sort of Middle Earth here yet. But the tree people that when planning is done around tree planting, around tree strategies and tree policies that councils are obligated to develop. What they do is they gather in a load of essentially biophysical data. So they gather in data around where trees are, how many trees, how old the trees are, what range of species they are, what size they are, what size the canopy is, what health they're in, all those kinds of things, where they're located, all that kind of thing. What they completely ignore, because it's difficult to gather and to understand, is the social and cultural values that people attach to treescapes. And people have all kinds of values, as you will know. I mean, no surprise that there are recreational values, there are economic values, there are spiritual values, there are memorial values, there are aesthetic values, health values that attach to trees. So our premise was that those values are constructed, reconstructed, negotiated, turn this damn thing off, and negotiated and reconstructed through the stories that we tell about our encounters with trees. That's how we convey and share and navigate through our values. When that is ignored, you get situations like we had a couple of years ago in Plymouth, where a row of trees in the city centre were felled overnight by the council, possibly for very good reason, maybe, but they were taken by surprise that actually people valued these trees more than they realised, and there was an uproar, and councillors got voted out of office at the next round of elections. Similar thing happened in Sheffield so long ago, and it's been repeated in various places around the country, because nobody thought to take into account the social and cultural values. So what we're trying to do is to map those social and cultural values, map them onto the biophysical values that we have, that we've got colleagues collecting, and to try and create a model that allows people to understand the interrelationship between the different sets of data that you might have, and that would hopefully lead to more intelligent and nuanced and textured decisions around tree planting and renewal and felling and management, so all those kinds of things. So that's what branching out is about. It was a 3-year project that's been extended for 4 years, and we're about 7 months away from the end, 6-7 months away from the end. So we're coming towards the end of that project. And I know it was something when Sarah was coming over, I invited Sarah to come along to some of the project meetings, the team meetings. This includes Open University, York University, the Stockholm Environment Institute, and Forest Research. Forest Research is the research wing of the Forestry Commission. So Sarah did along to some of those meetings. I was quite taken by that project, and thought, well, this could be really, maybe we can think about a version of branching out. I mean, some learning can take and try and do something in Baltimore. And since I found out through that Baltimore is full of tree people.
It is.
You can't move for tree people. You can't throw a stone without hitting a tree person in Baltimore. They're all over the place.
That's true. But having said that, we have a lot of those same problems with, the heat canopies and all the, there's not enough to tackle the issues that we have. So, and some of them are, pocket parks, these little things that might only be 3 or 4 trees, right? But I think those are the kinds of stories that when we think about planning and policy, right, it's the bottom line of what is that tree worth economically. Sometimes ecosystem services, what are those kinds of things, but much rarer to really think about what those sociocultural values are. So particularly it helps people, in this era where we're thinking about climate change so much, we really need to be thinking about how do the stories that people have about their local environment help us learn about local expertise, local lore, local family stories, because they're often attached to particular trees where particular things happened. And so I feel like that's a really compelling, I was telling this to one of my colleagues in Baltimore, and we agreed that this could be about water bodies. It could be about, Baltimore is a very, water, obviously we're on the coast, lots of issues around the Chesapeake Bay. So it could easily incorporate other natural assets as well. But I think we were talking about, where else could this project go? Where else could this treescapes go? And what kinds of research and what kinds of policy could it inspire once we sort of map those biophysical data onto sociocultural data? How does that change how policy happens? How does that shape how planning happens? And what other sort of context, national context, could we bring that in? And that could certainly function as an international way of thinking about co-production and sustainability, in local and global inputs and outputs, thinking about just communities as we all think about environmental inequities, and who faces the biggest brunt of climate change. So that was an example we wanted to bring in from the work. And one of the reasons that I came here was to learn more about branching out, because that was certainly a place of overlapping commitment and interest was in urban forestry. And so that was one of the reasons that I was particularly, having worked with urban forest projects, that was a really compelling thing for me. So we come to our last, but not final, right? The last slide, but not the final slide. When you think about where you sit in the university, for some of you who are coming from different places, what could this partnership look like, sound like, feel like? And, we just put these are some of the things that you've all mentioned up here, but what sort of strikes you Now, I asked you at the we asked you at the very beginning to sort of think about an international aspiration. Do you have any different ideas or something that came to you as you sort of listened to other people talk, or as you listened to us sort of think aloud? And we don't even have to say anything, like, it's nice to have this.
Where's Siri?
I don't know, I've turned Siri off.
Yeah, where's
Where's Siri when you need it?
I'm very interested in the kind of notion of creative practice and how that could be developed further. And we were talking earlier, weren't we, about these ideas about what it's okay to imagine, who's got the authority to imagine what. And I kind of feel that where that leads us in terms of creative practice, we've got lots of ideas about how we work as creatives, but particularly with new environments that we're creating in, for example, online spaces, and gaming environments, those sort of environments. I'm really interested now in where the next things are going and what we might imagine beyond that. So yeah, creative practice would be fruitful collaboration, I think.
Yeah, that was such an interesting conversation about sort of imagine, in what cultural context can we imagine what's allowed in certain spaces, what's limited in certain spaces. Yeah, that was a really interesting conversation. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, because we've opened up the space enormously to all sorts of voices that would never have been heard, which is really excellent. But then what does that do to people who want to imagine beyond their own experience?
Yeah.
Where does that take us? Is
And
that something we're not
yeah.
going to do anymore, or is that, but surely that's a kind of very enriching thing to be able to imagine beyond ourselves and to have empathy.
Yeah, absolutely, and but you're also entering those difficult spaces there, aren't you? In with creative practice around different sort of cultural understandings and contexts and those kinds of things. And do you end up with something that is a kind of I don't know, some kind of compromise across, and it's a mishmash of different cultural elements, rather than end up not respecting any particular. There are those kind of difficulties to navigate, and
indeed,
and I think the history of theatre is littered with the corpses of people who've attempted to do this kind of internationalised work, and fallen foul of, and particularly in a post-colonial context, that is particularly complex then.
Absolutely right. So yeah,
I'm thinking of particularly of Peter Brook's Mahabharata and things like that.
Yeah, the list is kind of
very
endless. But does that mean we just?
Well, no, quite. I have no answer to that. I have no answer. And this was actually one of the things we were talking about yesterday as well, is that as we move at the moment, we spent a lot of time in the last decade, 2 decades, working out how to work across the academy with different disciplines and kind of interdisciplinary approaches. How do we tackle the fact that the theatre people talk a completely different language to the physicists, to the health scientists, to the geographers, and not only do we talk a different language, we sometimes use the same words to mean different things, which gives it confusion. And we even understand research and the purpose of the research differently, why we do research, what it looks like, and those have been very difficult, sometimes comic conversations over the years. But now, as we move into a more of a transdisciplinary space, where we're moving beyond the academy and bringing people from outside in, you've got another set of tensions. And I was in a discussion yesterday with some colleagues from Sweden about trying to organise a transdisciplinary event, in that very often you've got different sets of expectations. So people who are from business or from other kind of stakeholder organisations, for instance, you're asking them to come to a day's event. What they want is something concrete out. They want a solution. They want something that they can take away and say, that's solving a problem for me. And the academics come in and all they want to do is problematize things. And they just want to create another set of questions and talk about it. So the different there are tensions. And I think that those tensions almost define transdisciplinarity. And part of our job as transdisciplinary workers is to try and stop those things becoming binaries and actually see that tension as part of the engine that drives the discussion. And are there ways in which those different expectations can work creatively and work effectively without it being necessarily one thing or the other? And it's really, again, it's one of those really hard things. It's very easy to say, let's create a transdisciplinary space, and we just have to invite the right people into the room. To actually make that a space that works for everybody is a whole different sort of order of things, I think.
Like the equitable partnerships.
Equitable partnerships as well, yeah.
In terms of perhaps teaching collaboration, I don't know. Sorry if it's long-winded, but I was thinking about the very word university, right? Which has been chosen for a purpose. And it seems to me that in the case of internationalization, nowadays it's something that we do, or that university do, as opposed to what they are. When if you go back a few centuries ago, university, the common language is Latin. I mentioned Erasmus earlier. It's not a big deal. It is expected of university to have students coming from all over the world. That's what I meant. And it's not a national enterprise or something. We don't do. I suppose maybe I'm fantasizing about universities of the past, but there's no expectation of doing internationalization better in La Sorbonne in the 15th century than in Oxford. Like it is here, that internationalization is an added value to, or everywhere. I mean, in all the universities in the UK, I suppose in the US as well, are we better at internationalization than our competitors, so to speak? And in this context, I've got one of my personal tutees who is in Joshibi in Japan. And she's the exception in all of them. I'm doing new groups of tutees, but I've got 25. And it's presented as something, it's very, when you should give a norm. And the last point I want to make is that now we got the tools to create, we can collaborate online, we could teach anybody around the planet, we could collaborate more closely, we got the tools. But when will we get into this kind of position where perhaps credits can be, I know there's a system of transferring credit from one to the other, but it's so complicated. And this student I mentioned is so complicated for her to even go for 1 year. I mean, she succeeded, she's got a lot of support from the university, it's all encouraged, but why is there only one? It seems that we are in this way where we can collaborate with people across the planet through the internet, but yet we're so far away from being international as opposed to doing international.
And I think that's right. And a lot of our structures, our governance structures, have yet to catch up with that reality that's been and that process has been accelerated through the pandemic around those things. You know, I mean, I can remember not so many years, in fact, years that I could count on one hand ago, being told that we couldn't take any online students because they had to come and enjoy the campus experience at Loughborough. And that may have made sense in 2018. There was a sense. It seems to be less tenable now, and I mean, I've had these discussions before, so I don't think I'm saying anything particularly radical here. But the idea, particularly where we're working with creative arts students who maybe wanted to come and do, say, doctoral study, because they have an existing high-level, well-developed practice over a number of years that they want to use as the basis for their study. What a great idea that you leave that practice in New York and come and relocate to Loughborough for 3 years to do the PhD work that you were actually more capable of doing, you know. Because there are other reasons for actually being a Loughborough student than actually coming and enjoying the campus. You know, as beautiful as the campus is,
Yeah.
you know, that there are other students have, and then as you say, in a digital international world where you have the digital supporting the face-to-face and vice versa, then it perhaps needs a reimagining of the structures that support those activities.
It's going towards this, because for a doctoral researcher, for example, in the School of Design and Creative Arts, it took a while, but we pushed at some point, as with the doctoral program teams, to have the bursary available, so the PhD bursary, the 3-year PhD available to international students, which it was not the case before. So last year it was the first time. And so some international students benefited from it, as opposed to only, that's what I was mentioning at the beginning, like UK based or EU, well, not EU anymore, but UK. So it's going this way where we accept that the students are from wherever and they can be Liverpool students or whatever. So, but it's still slow, I think.
It's very, yeah, that interrogation of the practice, our own practice, is very slow in coming. But the more work we do here, the more we can at least name the problematic practices and then keep them pushing forward. Well, I know you,
I
yeah.
can see people dropping away online just because of time. But we can draw to a close there. You're all invited to lunch next door and you definitely carry on the conversation by all means.